The first session of the 2021 Ohio Beef Cattle Management School was hosted via Zoom by the Ohio State University Extension Beef Team on January 18th. During that first session, the focus was on making quality hay for beef cattle with an emphasis on soil fertility and seed species selection when doing a new seeding. In the portion of the presentation that follows, Christine Gelley discusses new seeding species selection and critical considerations when establishing a new stand of forage. Let's listen in as the host, Extension Beef Field Specialist Garth Ruff, introduces Christine.
Let's transition to our second speaker of the night. Forage fertility is super important as we look at establishing new hay fields. And once we get the fertility right, one of the more common questions we get is, what species can I plant? Should I plant for my beef cows? And Christine Gelley, Extension Educator, Ag and Natural Resources from Noble County, is going to address that very topic. Christine.
Thank you, Garth, and thank you everyone for joining us for tonight's webinar. I've got about 25 slides here, and I think we'll have plenty of time to get through those. I am happy to take your questions after we complete all the slides. So if we don't address it right away, just hang on tight and we will get to them. To save everyone's internet connection, I'm going to turn my video off here and focus on our presentation. Okay, so whether you are seeding a pasture for the first time or you're seeding a pasture that you've done before, you likely have some considerations to take into account for on what's going to go in next and how you're going to actually establish that next. That's what we're going to talk about in this presentation today. So first off, what are the critical needs of our pastures or hay fields? What do we need them to provide for us? And essentially, that is feed that is nutritious, delicious, and plentiful. We need all three of those to be successful in our venture. If the feed's not nutritious, it's not helpful to us. If the animals don't eat it because it tastes bad, but it's the most nutritious thing in the world, that also doesn't help us. They've got to consume it. And then we have to have enough of it to make it worth harvesting. And that was a question that we encountered throughout the year this year with experiencing some of those lower than average. At what point should I maybe not harvest yet? How long do I wait? But these are the three things that we're really looking for our pastures to provide for us. If your pastures are falling short of those expectations, it's probably time to evaluate what's happening there and what can we do about it. So first off, let's identify what the problems are that are leading you to this decision that I'm going to reseed this pasture. And you could be taking some, turning it into pasture hayfield, and that's fine too. And in that case, your problem is, I don't want to grow this crop anymore. I want to grow something else. Once we've identified what those problems are, we need to identify a solution. There will be many potential solutions to your problems, and it may take some trial and error to figure out what exactly the right one is. And of course, life happens. Things don't happen in the perfect time frame or the perfect timeline. And so I've found through my own endeavors and those of my clients, it's good to develop 2 to 3 backup solutions in case that first one doesn't actually play out the way you hope. We need to definitely establish that if you choose to ignore those existing causes of current problems, reseeding your pasture or hayfield is not going to improve the situation. If we don't address those problems, we're going to see those pop up after we've gone through the effort of seeding new forages. So first off, we've got to identify and address those issues. So I'd like to see some comment here in the chat. Why are you reseeding? If you were going to pick one of your pastures or hayfields and reseed it, what would be the reason for you? A, there's too many weeds. B, the stand is too old. C, I have too many bare patches. D, the yield is low. E, The gains of my cattle are low. F, I'm bored and looking for something to do. I don't know anyone who would actually answer that, but that could be you. Or G, another reason. If you like to use the chat box, you can go ahead and put an answer in the chat. I'm just curious what's on your mind when thinking about those problem areas you may want to reseed. One that I hear a lot is A, I have too many weeds. And I think the reason I have too many weeds is because my stand is too old. Well, in most cases, all cases, weeds are a symptom of other problems. So if the reason for reseeding is I have too many weeds, there's probably a problem we need to address, and it's likely related to soil fertility. So if you didn't listen to Jason's talk, you need to go back and listen to it. If you've joined us later, if you're watching the recording, because soil fertility is everything for establishing your stand of forages and keeping it growing into the future. I'm seeing lots of A's, B's, and C's. Yeah, bare patches are very common in our pasture fields where we have animals grazing. We've got some low yields as answers here too. And any of these could be reasonable causes for reseeding. But again, we've got to find the cause of those issues in the first place if we're going to make a lasting impact. So then the next question may be, when is the right time for me to actually reseed this pasture? I've just established that I need to reseed. Now, when can I start? It really depends on the forage type that you choose, and we are going to get to that. But for most perennial grass and legume species in Ohio, you're going to choose either a spring planting date or a late summer, early fall date. We have lots of annual options as well. And on our next webinar, we're going to talk about annuals. So I won't talk about annuals tonight, but they could be a solution to a gap in your system almost any time of year, because we have spring annuals, summer annuals, and winter annuals too that would likely be seeded in the fall in that case. So if you find yourself not having success with those perennial crops, I highly suggest looking at an annual crop to tie you to the next seeding time. Now we do have some clovers that can be seeded with success in late winter by the method of frost seeding. I know some producers that frost seed every year. They just go through and add some seed into the stand to get that composition of clovers up to where they want it to be. And that's a great solution to a common problem. It may solve all of your issues, but it's something we can do that's fairly low cost, fairly labor, that tend to have pretty good success. And I'll share some more about frost seeding as we go along. But when we are talking about reseeding a new stand, a completely new field of forage, we're likely going to look at either those spring or late summer options. And for many producers, late summer turns out to be the best time. And that's because the weather conditions that we've had here lately are not as conducive to spring planting because we can't get into the fields with the moisture correct. If we get in there and it's too wet, we do more harm than good. So it's really better to wait for more conducive conditions than to try to seed into an area where we're just setting ourselves up for failure. So the critical point here, I think, when you're deciding between a spring planting or a fall planting is the moisture. Is it too wet in the spring at the time you're trying to seed? If it is, wait. Just wait until fall, because you'll likely wind up wishing that you did. And if you've already done the work to prepare the site, I would suggest going with one of the annual options to help you combat weeds and just continue to prepare the site for that fall planting. And of course, soil testing should be your first step in the process for everything that Jason has just talked about. We have no idea what forages are going to fit our system if we don't have this starting point. Knowing a baseline of forage fertility, what are our soils offering? What can they sustain right now in terms of growth? And where are we trying to go? So whether you're trying to keep the same stand that you already have and improve it, or start all over, testing is step number one. Before you even pick out a catalog to look at seed, do your soil tests and get those results back and talk about them with a helpful consultation from your extension agent or somebody from Soil and Water, whoever you're comfortable with sharing those results. And then choose your forages based on the soil conditions you will have at planting, not 6 to 12 months later. And the reason I specifically say that is because we know lime takes time to neutralize soils. In my part of Ohio, we almost always see that lime needs applied to the pasture or hayfield. And it's going to take 6 to 12 months to see the impact that that lime is taking on the soil condition. So if you don't want to wait 6 to 12 months to seed, you need to choose your forages based on the pH that you have now, not what you're hoping to get 6 to 12 months down the road. So address those fertility needs right out of the gate. That's step number one. Now, plan to treat or outcompete those weeds. And I say and or because even if you do everything in your possible ability to take care of weeds beforehand, you're going to have some as time goes along. No one has a 100% pure stand of desirable forages. There will be weeds, but the biggest factor is, can my desirable plants outcompete those weeds? That's going to be something that takes a closer analysis. What type of weeds are you dealing with? What type of a weed control program makes sense for you? If you are an organic grower, you're going to need a specialized plan to take care of your weeds in a timely manner before seeding. It may take longer and you're looking at a situation where you're willing and able to use a herbicide. Not that one is better than the other, but you're looking at different timeframes for either system. So take that into consideration. If we do not make a plan to compete with those weeds, our seeding, it has been kind of a waste of time because we're going to wind up applying that fertilizer we just put in to weed growth instead of our seed growth. When it comes to choosing the mixture for our stand, we want to choose a mix that makes sense for us, for you as a producer, not what looks prettiest in the catalog, not what we think is going to sell the most hay to our neighbor down the road, but what is best for your equipment, for your soils, and for your feeding program. If you take a look at these two pictures I have shown here, you see different species, right? For those of you following and that can use the chat, what do you see in the first picture on the left-hand side? When I look at this, I see a lot of orchard grass. I see some tall fescue. I see a lot of white clover, and I see some Canada thistle in there in the mix. But for the most part, I would call this a orchard, tall fescue, white clover stand. And this is a hayfield that is harvested to feed beef cattle. The picture on the right-hand side has some drastic differences, but this is also a successful mix used to feed beef cattle. This mixture contains warm season perennial grasses, including switchgrass, Indian grass, and big bluestem, red clover, which is a cool season legume, and bird's foot trefoil, also a cool season legume. And this is a highly productive stand, contributing great nutritive value to the hay stock. Both of these acceptable mixes. Something to keep in mind too, looking at those mixes, is once you get more than 5 species in your mix, count on some of those dropping out 3 to 5 years down the road, because those plants will compete with each other as well. Usually you will wind up with 3 to 5 really competitive and persistent forages in the stand. The others may hang around a little bit, but don't count on them pulling their weight for the long term. So going into those super fancy mixes may not have a long-term benefit for you. So try to keep it practical with the ones that suit your equipment and make sense in your feeding program. And shop for them ahead of time. Don't just walk into the feed store the week you want to plant and ask them for a good beef hay mix, because they will sell you whatever's on the shelf that they sell in their catalog and their brand line. Whatever's in stock, that's what you're going to get. And that may not be the best choice for you. So take the time right now here in January to gather up some seed catalogs, read about the different varieties of each type of forage, and choose the one that you like the best. You can look at things like seeding rates. You look at things like maturity rate. We have late maturing and early maturing. And you may make those choices based on if you're going to hay or graze. There's so much versatility out there when you look at different types of forages. If you don't give yourself this benefit of shopping ahead of time, um, you're not going to wind up choosing the forage that's really best suited for you. So get those catalogs and start taking a look. Now, when it gets to more specific options, I've got some of the most common perennial grass options here for Ohio listed, along with their seeding rate, their recommended planting date, and their planting depth. And I'll just go through this chart and give you some specifics about each one. We could talk for a half an hour more about each one, but we'll keep it really short. So Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is a very short growing perennial grass. It is ideal for situations where you know that you're going to be cutting the system quite low or grazing frequently. It does pretty good with frequent abuse. It'll bounce back, and it does fairly well in some challenging fertility situations. Um, so this one I recommend a lot in areas where we know that our equipment maybe doesn't have as high of a cutting ability. And we know we're going to be harvesting close to the ground. Note the planting depths on all of these. None of them on here, these perennial grass mixes, should be seeded at greater than a half an inch. A half an inch is not very deep. And that's one of the most common causes of stand failures when we seed forages is seeding too deep. So pay very close attention to these seeding depths, both when you are selecting your forages and when you're selecting the equipment that you'll use to plant them. Orchard grass is one of the most common that we see used in hay mixes for all types of species. It is reliable. It has proven the test of time. We know how to use it. We know how to feed it. When you're looking at types of orchard grass, in most cases, I would suggest going with a late maturing orchard grass. What that's going to do is give you more time to get into the field and harvest it before the seed heads come on. And experiencing these springs that are abnormally wet for a long period of time, we need all the time that we can buy when it comes to beating the seed head emergence. Perennial ryegrass. Now, perennial ryegrass is one that we kind of have a love-hate relationship with when you're on the border of southern and northern Ohio. And I-70 seems to be kind of the cutoff point of the state where perennial rye either does really well or struggles. I'm on the southern half of I-70, but I'm sure many of you listening are on the northern half. And perennial rye seems to do really well in the northern half of Ohio, but the southern half tends to struggle. It is not very persistent to drought, and it tends to go dormant for most of the summer, more so in the southern half than the northern half. When we use perennial rye mixes down here, what we tend to see is they get outcompeted by the other grasses in the stand. However, it is a very palatable forage. It is easy to establish, it's vigorous, and it can produce really nice hay. It does have some, it can be hard to dry down, but it's a very pretty looking grass in the stand. But I would be cautious if you're in the southern half. Reed canary grass. This one is often considered a noxious weed. So it may seem odd that it's on the list here. But reed canary grass has its benefits, and as you may guess by its name, it grows pretty well in wet spots. And we've been finding many wet spots here in the past 5 years that I've been with Extension. That's one of the most common complaints I hear is that the soils in this area are too soggy and I can't keep anything in the stand. It's just weeds. Well, reed canary grass does not mind wet feet. and it is extremely competitive, very vigorous once you get the seed started. So containment is something we need to keep in mind with reed canary grass. It does like to travel down waterways, but it can be very beneficial in those areas that are chronically wet for much of the season. Smooth brome grass is less common, but I think it deserves a little bit more attention. Smooth brome is much different than that broom grass or broom sedge that you see out in the pasture. Not the same, but often confused. Smooth grass is a very palatable, soft textured grass that does quite well in many situations. It's not as persistent as the others, but if you see that in a beef mix, I would be confident using it in most cases. Tall fescue. Now, tall fescue, again, we've got a love-hate relationship, a strong one here with tall fescue. Tall fescue, Kentucky 31, has caused many issues for beef producers for years, decades. And that has to do with that endophyte that lives inside the forage. Our Kentucky 31 tall fescue, which is likely the fescue growing alongside every roadway in Ohio and somewhere in a pasture field near you, um, that endophyte aids the plant in times of stress. It allows it to be more tolerant to drought, more tolerant to uh, soggy conditions. It makes it able to bounce back from grazing quite well. But that endophyte causes vascular constriction in grazing animals when consumed in fairly high quantities. So the best option with tall fescue, if you're looking at establishing a new stand, is to use a novel endophyte variety. The novel endophyte varieties have an endophyte inside that aids the plant, but does not have the anti-quality factors for livestock. It tends to be pretty persistent. We've heard very good things about its utilization, but it is quite a bit more expensive than that Kentucky 31 variety. There's a reason. Pay the extra money. And then Timothy here is the last one on the list. A lot of people really like Timothy. I'm not as big of a fan, and that's mainly due to the persistence of Timothy. It doesn't compete super well, so if you want to put Timothy in the mix, it's great nutrition-wise, but it's likely not going to hang out with the others for as long. Now, if we move on to our perennial legumes, this slide will take a lot less time, so hang there with me. I know that was a long chart. When we look at these perennial legumes, alfalfa is one we use a lot for our hay crops, but not needed as much for the common beef cow than for our dairy herds. So if you find that your soil acidity is not appropriate for alfalfa, do not dismay. There are other options that can provide some of the same benefits that alfalfa do, although maybe not as elegant when we talk about them. Most commonly, I would suggest using white clover in the mix. It's not very expensive, it's very reliable. Use a ladino clover. These are improved white clover varieties rather than the kind you'll just find growing wild out in the stands. Our ladino white clovers have greater leaf area, so you're going to get more pounds of forage when you see these. I'm going to kind of go backwards through this chart this time. Red clover is often considered a better option for hay crops. It's taller growing, and you can really increase your crude protein values when you're using red clover in hay mixtures. It's not as persistent, though. We may need to go back and reseed red clover into our stands in about 3 to 5 years, as opposed to white clover that tends to hang out for quite a bit longer. Bird's foot trefoil is an interesting one to consider using. The big benefit of bird's foot trefoil when we look at the tolerance to stressors here is that it tolerates fairly acidic soils. But we've had some trouble getting this one established. It doesn't like fall seeding. It doesn't frost seed very well. So really, if you're going to seed bird's foot, you need to do it in the spring, pretty early in the spring, as you can see from the chart. So if you miss that planting window and you try to squeeze it in somewhere else, it's probably not going to succeed very well for you. But in some cases, it's been very successful. But of the options on this list, bird's foot is the most tolerant to low pH. So now, after going through these charts and sifting through all of the forage seed catalogs from the dealers you like, let's talk about what you need to do in that first year of establishment. We're going to move on also to seeding methods here in a moment, but what does our year look like after our seeding date? Well, if you choose to seed in the spring, count on waiting at least 60 days from the planting date to the harvest date. We want to give these plants adequate time to develop good roots. Even if the plant winds up going to seed in between that time, good root development is the most important thing for a perennial forage. If it does not set good roots in that first year, it's not going to thrive for the long term. So give that plant plenty of time to establish roots. Go out there and tug on it a little bit. See how difficult it is for it to come out of the ground. And if it comes out too easily, you know it's too early. It needs more time for root establishment. If you're looking at those late summer or early fall plantings, you should not harvest, clip, or grade that plant in the springtime sometime. Ideally, do your first harvest of that crop mechanically. That's again going to aid in root development. Wait to graze these until the soils are firm. If you allow the animals back in too early, it's going to damage the root zone of these plants. It would damage the tissues above ground. We just want to be patient and give these plants time to grow. Now, I've talked mostly about perennials, and I'm going to stick on that topic today. But if you find yourself in a situation where some annual forages are interesting to you, there's a lot of options you can go with that can be planted at various times of year, as you can see here on the chart. And these can give you a lot more flexibility in your production system, whether you're looking for a cover crop in between spring and fall because you missed your planting window, or you're trying to fight summer slump and you need some forage to graze or harvest in the middle of summer when everything else is kind of slow. And then we've got a lot of winter options here too for extended grazing or of a stored feed. We'll hear more about those in the next webinar. Now that you've selected your forage type and your planting time, it's time to select your seeding method. And there are kind of three methods that I'm going to focus on in the talk: are conventional tillage methods, which incorporate broadcast seeding, then the method where we control weeds, and then we use a no-till drill, which you can see in the photo below here. And then the other option is doing some frost seeding. And there is a way that you can kind of do in between conventional tillage and using a no-till drill, depending on your situation. And we'll get into that. When we look at what the conventional seeding methods are, we are trying to create an ideal seed bed for our plants. And that ideal seed bed is going to be one that's smooth, firm, and free of weeds. Now, while we're trying to create that, we also don't want to overwork the soil. If we create too fine of a texture with our soil, we are depleting moisture and we are increasing the chances of surface crusting. If we get a crusty soil on top, our plants are going to have trouble emerging. And that's going to cause us some delays in the spring, and we may wind up reseeding that stand if the plants germinate and then can't break through the soil surface. A firm seed bed is going to allow us to get good seed to soil contact and reduce the rate of drying out. We want to get enough moisture into that seed so that it actually germinates. And so how firm is firm? When you take a walk through that field, when you step into it, your footprint should not sink any more than 3/4 of an inch. If it goes deeper than that, it's too soft. When we move on to looking at those no-till or minimal till seeding options, there's some distinct advantages on a slope. Utilizing no-till or minimal tillage seeding is going to decrease your issues with erosion. It's going to decrease issues with moisture loss. It will save you time and fuel, labor, and it'll be easier to have firm conditions because we're not disrupting that soil surface. This is most successful though on well-drained soils. It is very easy to seed too deep with the no-till drill. And if your soils are wet, you're going to seed too deep. So knowing that our seed placement is absolutely critical, we need to choose between these options. If when it comes to managing our crop residue, there's a point at which it's too much to use your no-till drill or use just a regular seeding drill. If you're at the point where you've got more than 35% coverage on that field, you'll want to use a no-till drill. You have more success getting through that residue. And again, a benefit of that residue is that it's going to help trap moisture and help that seed germinate. But we want to make sure whatever that soil residue or residue on the soil is, it's not going to wind up competing with the seed that we just put in the ground. So we do want to use some type of a method uh, to eliminate the previous crop. You can also utilize a chisel plow or a disc if needed to break up that residue on the soil. And that can certainly be helpful if you're dealing with a rough textured situation. Like I mentioned, seeding depth is absolutely critical when we are seeding a new forage. Know the seeding depth of the type that you are going to plant. They vary. They vary between clovers and grasses. They vary grass to grass. Most cool season forages should be planted between 1/4 and 1/2 inch. It is critical, I've said that word so many times, that you get off the tractor and go check how deep the seed is placed in the ground. Take that step at the very beginning. It is going to absolutely determine if you are successful or not with your seeding. It is the most common reason that seedings fail, is that the seed is planted too deep. When you are seeding into tilled ground, you want to have a seeder with press wheels. And if you can get a cultipacker on there, that's ideal. One that we use a lot in our area is the Brilliant Seeder from our Soil and Water Conservation District. The equipment that's available locally to you is going to vary depending on what county you live in and the resources around you, but we find that our Soil and Water district here helps many people seed their pastures by allowing them to rent equipment. And that Brilliant Seeder is excellent if you have fairly level ground. One method that people have looked into is hydroseeding, and this has become more and more common in areas where we have oil and gas development or in landscape situations. It can be successful too for pastures, and that would be where you're blending the seed with fertilizer while applying it. But this is tricky. It's tricky to get the rates correct and use the equipment appropriately. So if this is something you're looking at, I suggest you hire a professional and supervise them closely to make sure everything is going according to plan. But due to the level of difficulty, if you're fairly new at this, I'd stay away from hydroseeding. As you see in the picture right here, this is an example of a drill that we have here in Noble County. This drill, it's a land pride drill. It is fitted with 3 different seed boxes, so you can seed any type of forage with this drill and should be successful if your tractor has enough horsepower to pull it. If you are choosing to use a drill, regardless of what type of drill, you must calibrate it. Please calibrate it. The way that you calibrate your drill is going to be outlined in your user manual. So locate the user manual and take a peek at it before you plan to go out to the field. Make sure that your equipment is cleaned. Inspect it from top to bottom, underneath, all around. Check things like tire pressure. Use an air compressor to blow cobwebs out of the lines. Check the drive settings. Check your seed cups. Check your pressure wheels. There's a lot of components on these pieces of equipment that can be adjusted. Make sure that the seeding rate is appropriate for the pure live seed in your mix, the germination rate. And you'll find when you look through the manual that the seeding rate used as a unit on the drill may not be in pounds per acre. It could be a percentage of the cup opening. So read through the manual and see what those settings actually mean. And then of course, do a field test. This is where you're going to be able to tweak those little parts of the calibration methods to get you exactly where you need to go and adjust as necessary until you achieve the correct seeding rate and depth. I have a link to a video at the end that actually can walk you through the steps of calibrating a drill. So save that link for later when it comes time. This is a picture showing you where the manual is located on this drill, and a picture of how the lines attach to the seed cups. It's very important to look at all of these things, to check for things like baling twine wrapped up in the equipment, like I mentioned, cobwebs, mouse nests. If there's anything obstructing the flow through these lines, it's going to throw off your seeding rate, and you might wind up disappointed. The helpful videos that I mentioned, you can find them either by utilizing the links that are listed here or by scanning these QR codes. Forage Focus is a video series that I've had the pleasure of producing with OSU South Centers for a couple years. And every month we do a half-an-hour video related to forage production. So these links will take you to those videos. The first one here, this is the entire list of our videos if you'd like to browse through them. The second is a video specifically talking about frost seeding. It was created coming out of the winter of 2018, which was extremely soggy and wet. And we talked a lot about frost seeding in that episode. And then in our fall seeding video, we actually show you pieces of equipment, how to use them appropriately, and then how to calibrate a drill. So if you're familiar with QR codes, if you have a smartphone, likely all you need to do is open up your camera, hold it over top of the QR code, and the website should pop up. Or you can choose to type in the links. And then we'll also share some links to helpful publications that are available for you. You can choose to print these or access them for free. There is an updated version of the agronomy guide that you can order, but you can find it here. It's not available for free, but you can order it from the OSU Publications website. There are older versions out there that you can find for free, but it has recently been updated, especially the forage chapters. So you want that most up-to-date version. Get yourself a forage crop pocket guide of some type. I really like this one that I've provided the link for, but there's a lot of them out there. It's great to just throw in the tractor, the four-wheeler, the buggy, whatever it is that you call it. Take it with you when you go places to help with things like ID and problem troubleshooting, things like the nutrient deficiencies that Jason spoke about, or insects. And that chart that I showed with all the options of different annual crops, that is available to print. You'll find it multiple places, but here's a link where you can find that one. I will share these links in the chat here while we do Q&A. And then I have a couple shameless advertisements for other programs coming up. If you've liked this webinar, we have some others I think you would enjoy too. And maybe some of you are already enrolled. We have a Pastures for Profit course going on right now. We invite you to join us for. And if you happen to have other types of livestock on your farm, including sheep or goats, we've got a webinar series that starts tomorrow night too. So I hope that you've enjoyed the webinar tonight. I hope that you may consider joining us in the future. And if you have any additional questions for me, my contact information is here on the screen.